evening. I'd like to welcome all of you here, and I want to begin with the students because without you, it would be a handful of us, right? And that wouldn't work well. We appreciate your presence here this evening. We are in the third year of what we call in the Department of International Relations the Dombeck Lecture Series. How did we come up with that name? The Dombeck family, Gail and Chuck Dombeck, had a son, Trevor Dombeck, who attended Bucknell, graduated in 2010. And one of the chairs of the Political Science Department had the fortune to meet Gail and Chuck Dombeck, and they graciously and generously provided the Department of International Relations with a grant, you might say, to support these activities. In 2009, we brought John Agnew from UCLA, who spoke on globalization and sovereignty. In 2010-11, we brought Jorge Castaneda from NYU, who had served in one of the administrations in Mexico. And in the spring of this year, we brought Professor Alex Dupe from Wesleyan University, who spoke on Haiti before and after the earthquake. And this fall, we have the honor and the privilege to bring to you Professor Bruno Gulli, who is an adjunct professor at Llewellyn University and also in the City University of New York system. Bruno Gulli was born in Calabria, Italy. He grew up in Italy, came to the United States in the middle of the 1990s, studied at San Francisco State University after earning his undergraduate degree in Italy in Chinese studies. And then he moved to the City University of New York system, where he earned his doctorate. At San Francisco State, he wrote his master's thesis on philosophy, looking at Nietzsche and Heidegger. And then in the City University of New York system, it has been comparative philosophy and literature. I met Bruno Gulli, I should say, my colleague and friend Lyndon Lewis, and I met him at the UMass Amherst in 2000. We attended a conference there on the question of the party is not over, right? You interpret that how you want to interpret it. And we have been in touch. Bruno has published a number of books, including one that came out last year, and numerous articles. A very prolific scholar, a very capable scholar, very critical. And as we were approaching this matter of the topic for this semester, I was speaking with Lyndon and I said, what do you think we might do? And he said, talk to Bruno Gulli. And I said, you know what, I'm thinking of something called sovereignty as domination and freedom in the moment of globalization. And when I wrote to Bruno, he said, exactly, because it comes out in part of his latest book, right? And it's remarkable that we have this scholar here. Now, those of you who are in my 250 and in my 400 and were in other classes know that I'm very, very critical of conventional notions of sovereignty. And we have a very capable scholar that we are bringing to you this evening. And we are sure, we are aware that he will do a fantastic job. Without further ado, and before Paul Sussman tells me my time is up, right? I present to you Professor Bruno Gulli.
Okay. Good evening, and thank you all for coming. It is an honor for me to be here, and I would like to thank Professor Watson for making this possible. My gratitude also goes to the Department of International Relations, to Bucknell University, and Gail and Chuck Dombeck for funding the lecture. I begin. Sovereignty is in crisis. The paradigm of domination and hegemonic power has entered a situation of crisis from which it will never probably recover. For this very reason, freedom and democracy appear today at a global level as real concrete possibilities. Indeed, I write and now deliver this lecture at a time when something unexpected and wonderful started in the streets of New York and spread like wildfire throughout the country and throughout the world. I am referring to the Occupy Wall Street movement, inspired in parts by the Arab Spring and by the movement of the indignant in Europe. All this gives special meaning to the theme of my lecture, and I will often return to this evening. Can you all hear me all right? Yes? Okay, good. Sovereignty as domination and the problem of freedom in the moment of globalization. The title doesn't say sovereignty as autonomy, independence, and freedom, a notion that has a history of its own and still finds application today in the politics of states, in political philosophy, and international relations. Rather, the title says sovereignty as domination, indicating not simply that we are dealing with the concept and reality of sovereignty when it takes on the modality of domination, but more strongly that sovereignty without domination is a practical and logical impossibility. So, it might be useful to give a clear definition of domination. The dictionary definition of domination as the exercise of power and control over something or someone will not do. I would then like to borrow Eva Feder-Kitay's definition of domination in her important book, Love's Labor, Essays on Women, Equality and Dependency. That's the name, by the way, of, maybe it's good for me to also write this, Eva Feder-Kitay. That's the name of the philosopher I mentioned. Kitay says, I'm quoting, domination is an illegitimate exercise of power, end quote. I repeat, domination is an illegitimate exercise of power, end quote. And she continues, I'm quoting again, it is inherently unjust, end quote. Sovereignty as domination is this illegitimacy and this injustice solidified, more precisely institutionalized and given the semblance of the law, the force of the law. When power is exercised illegitimately, whether in a legal or illegal fashion, it is not simply used, it is abused. In the etymology of the word abuse, the prefix ab conveys the idea of a separation, detachment, being away. This separation, which in philosophy is typical of traditional metaphysics, is always and necessarily inscribed in the concept of sovereignty, as Jacques Maritain powerfully shows in Man and the State. That's another philosopher that I will mention again, so I put his name on the board, Jacques Maritain. There can be no sovereignty without separation, because sovereignty is the exercise of supreme power. And what is supreme must be over and beyond, above everything else which is not supreme. Thus, sovereignty is never simply the use of power. Instead, it is always a form of abuse, and thus an illegitimate use of power, an illegitimate exercise of power. The fact that this exercise of power might be legal, as it has been historically the case with slavery, apartheid, and so on, should not deter us from our analysis and critique. Indeed, sovereignty is the law, and the law is sovereign. To be sure, sovereignty is the law as command, an arbitrary form of compulsion superimposed on the order of things and on life. I will return to this later to say how there can be a different type of law. Certainly, it belongs to the character of the law to decide as to the legality or illegality of things. Legality and illegality are given the names of right and wrong, but this is in itself a very problematic operation. Indeed, it is very often a wrongful appropriation of these words and in itself another form of abuse. In fact, right and wrong belong in the province of ethics, not of the law. I repeat, right and wrong belongs in the province of ethics, not of the law. And if the law seriously aspires to achieve a sense of right and wrong, it must turn itself to ethics and morality, as international law has been trying to do with incredibly great difficulties and up to now not at all successfully. Otherwise, the law, which I'd like to dub the small law, can do anything it likes to do and call the right wrong and the wrong right. History is filled with substantial and tragic examples of this. The history of modernity, which is the history of sovereignties, a history of violence, is precisely the history of the small law getting the upper hand, so to speak, and trying to make the right wrong and the wrong right. The age of conquest, the subjugation and extermination of the native populations of the Americas and other areas of the world, the enslavement of Africans and other people, are all to be understood in this light, a rather grim light. The super-exploitation of labor by capital, of all labor and all life by capital, the history of colonialism and imperialism, the present stage of the world whose economies and ecologies are on the brink of collapse, must also be understood as a political, social, and economic contingencies actualized by the abuses of violent powers that give themselves the force of the law and the sanctity of sovereignty. We call these powers states, nation states, and to them we ascribe the character of sovereignty, or at least we don't usually challenge the fact that they appropriate and retain that character. Indeed, as Professor Watson notes in a recent as yet unpublished article, I'm quoting, force and violence have played important roles in the making of modern statehood, end quote. The law absolves itself, and in so doing, it gives itself the character of the absolute. The warning we see everywhere, it's the law, is a very good illustration of this. However, the statement, it's the law, does not say much, especially when we consider it from the point of view of life and from the point of view of ethics. This is one of the main issues discussed in Plato's Euthyphro. For those who might not know, Euthyphro is the title of a so-called early dialogue by, or Socratic dialogue by Plato. So, this is one of the main issues discussed in Plato's Euthyphro, a foundational text in ethics and in the formulation of the asymmetry between ethics on the one hand and the law on the other. When Euthyphro, a sophist, tells Socrates that his action prosecuting his own father for murder is right and just because it is in accordance with the law, because the law says so, because, I'm quoting the law is so, end quote, he is met by Socrates' irony and dialectics that deconstruct the assumption of the law from the point of view of the moral truth, which is always the same and cannot be bent to serve any particular interest. Indeed, any law or system of laws can absolve itself even of heinous crimes without even trying to answer the question as to what sustains it, the question of its rightness or wrongness. In fact, answering that question is not required of the sovereign law, and even asking the question, which is the task of freedom and critical thinking, is seen as a provocation. This self-absolution of the law and the prerogative it ascribes to itself of being beyond any questioning are also typical traits of sovereignty. They are not simply found at the level of the politics of states, in the way in which the most powerful states assert themselves in the world, politically, economically, and militarily. They are also found in national and domestic matters and at all levels of everyday life. Thus, strong and weak states alike exercise the same type of power, and that is domination, over their territories and the people, citizens and non-citizens, living within them. They do this through the many state and non-state institutions that in various ways participate in the same logic of security: the police, the prison, the hospital, the schools, the banks, the airports, and so on. However, the absolute character of sovereignty is a fiction and a myth. And this is indeed one of the truths to come out of the Occupy Wall Street movement. By this I mean to say that sovereign power, the sovereign law, is simply a small fraction of the whole that has the pretense of totality and absoluteness. It puts forth that pretense by presenting itself and in practice becoming separate from the rest of the totality of beings, by superimposing itself on the totality of life as a fixed and dead partiality. Such is the case whether we think of the classic figure of the sovereign, the king, who is a king in virtue of divine rights, or as in the current powerful language of the Occupy Wall Street movement, the 1% exerting its domination over all other beings, human beings, but also the non-human animals and also the environment, who are the 99%. Such is the case with the too big to fail institutions, recently renamed systematically dangerous institutions, and actually the other day Glenn Greenwald called them, on Democracy Now! Called them the too big to jail institutions, which posit themselves above the law. And as it is also generally the case with the domination of capital over labor, the subsumption of living labor under capital, which is nothing, capital itself is nothing but dead labor. But we should also try to understand this by means of a philosophical critique of the concept of sovereignty, and particularly of its pretense to the character of the absolute. In my book, Earthly Plenitudes, a study on sovereignty and labor, I try to do this by way of going back to the work of Jacques Maritain, a 20th century philosopher. That's the name of Jacques Maritain. A 20th century philosopher whom I mentioned earlier. In a book called Man and the State, Maritain holds that sovereignty is another name for absolutism, and that as such it must be discarded from political discourse and from the political sphere. Discarded not because it is obsolete as others hold, but because it is wrong. This is so because in theology, as a Catholic philosopher, Maritain thinks that the concept of sovereignty, more precisely genuine sovereignty, makes sense in the spiritual sphere, and that is the sphere of theology. This is so because in theology, which is part of traditional metaphysics, we have the concept of separation, which is necessarily included in the concept of sovereignty. I'm quoting from Maritain, who says, God, the separate whole, is sovereign over all the created world, end quote. For Maritain, quoting again, with sovereignty, separation is required as an essential quality, end quote. In other words, the creator and everything that is created are different from one another. There is a distance and a gap between the creator and what he creates. That's the idea. However, this is not the case in the political sphere, where the separation and transcendence posited by the theorists of sovereignty, Jean Bodin being the first among them, in order to justify the concept of sovereignty itself, is in reality the result of a philosophical, logical, and metaphysical error. For Maritain, the error lies in grasping the position of the human sovereign as above the peak rather than at the peak. Though we should add that even when the sovereign is understood as being at the peak, and that is to say, as inside and outside at the same time, which is a common contemporary interpretation of sovereignty, the situation is no less problematic. I would like to give a long, important quote from Maritain when he deals with Bodin's classic understanding of sovereignty. I'm quoting, this is a long quote, since the people have absolutely deprived and divested themselves of their total power in order to transfer it to the sovereign and invest him with it, then the sovereign is no longer a part of the people and the body politic. He is divided from the people. He has been made into a whole, a separate and transcendent whole, which is his sovereign living person, and by which the other whole, the immanent whole of the body politic, is ruled from above. When Jean Bodin says that the sovereign prince is the image of God, this phrase must be understood in its full force, and means that the sovereign, submitted to God but accountable only to him, transcends the political whole just as God transcends the cosmos. Either sovereignty means nothing, or it means supreme power, separate and transcendent, and ruling the entire body politic from above. That is why this power is absolute, which means non-bound, separate, and consequently unlimited in its extension as well as in its duration, and not accountable to anything on earth. End quote. That's the end of the long quote from Maritain. Of course, the same analysis applies to Hobbes's formulation of the theory of sovereignty in his Leviathan. It seems to me that it is difficult to disagree with Maritain's accounts leading to the claim that sovereignty is an erroneous concept. What he demonstrates is that the absoluteness of absolute power is untenable from an ontological point of view. The absolute power of the monarch, with his divine rights, typical of Louis XIV, does not really have absolute power, if words are to have a meaning, but a semblance